American Comics. My Warhammer Simulator Chapter 251 to 260. Accompanying the heavy footsteps that grew louder, Luo Sha, driving the blue power armor, walked out of the forging workshop. The plans given by Radiatus were a tactical nuclear weapon with a yield of 100,000 tons. Or a large-scale firestorm weapon made of phosphorus mixed with promethium. Of course, both of these would take time to manufacture. So, Luo Sha was given room to choose and think. At this time, Luo Sha, with a solemn expression, walked towards the lounge. He waved to dismiss the automatic servo robots that were about to come forward to disassemble the armor. Wearing the metal shell covered with dust and blood, the power armor returned to the lounge. Luo Sha stood under the shower. He simply rinsed off the stains on the metal shell. Then he turned and walked to the metal bed, slowly sitting on the floor. Luo Sha closed his eyes slightly. He didn't feel any fatigue, just wanted to calm down and meditate. In fact, although Luo Sha proposed the idea of a regional extinction order, this idea still caused him a certain degree of mental stress. This wasn't as simple as killing a few bad guys, but a major event involving the life and death of millions of people, even hundreds of thousands of families. This kind of immense pressure, where countless lives hung by a thread, and life and death were all in one person's thought, almost made him feel a sense of suffocation. Emperor bless. I can truly understand the problems that those commanders of the human empire in the Warhammer universe face. Muttering to himself, Luo Sha subconsciously licked the fangs in his mouth. Luo Sha, Luo Sha, what are you going to do? Are you going to follow Radiatus's idea and use large-scale destructive weapons to solve all problems, or think of other ways to save those innocent civilians? Hundreds of thousands of people, they're not just livestock, they're living human beings. But this is a war. War allows no slackness. In 72 hours. Whether it's a tactical nuclear weapon or a large-scale firestorm weapon, it will be manufactured. Before that, I still want to try. Even if I still have to use the regional extinction order, I still want to try. Luo Sha, with his eyelids closed, suddenly opened his eyes, revealing a pair of cyan wolf eyes with a faint light. Save more humans. Dong, 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 56 heavy combat servitors, wearing thick composite armor, carrying heavy weapons and countless ammunition that could crush a gang of dogs, slowly entered large transport trucks. At the same time, 500 automatic servo robots, equipped with heavy logging guns, also entered the transport carriages with a large number of ammunition boxes. Then, they lined up neatly together, after everything was arranged properly. One large transport truck after another drove out of the underground base's tunnel and converged with the gang of dogs who were still resting on the way. At the same time, Luo Sha, with a solemn expression, and Iron Man David, as well as Blade, Eric, who was temporarily staying at the base, gathered in the brightly lit base hall. Eric, are you sure that those believers who worship the blood cult have been infected with vampire habits? Luo Sha, with a stern expression, turned his head slightly. He stared at Eric, who was wearing a black leather trench coat, and asked softly. They subconsciously fear light and silver weapons. And they are extremely disgusted with Allison. Even if these things don't actually cause them much harm, they are still afraid. These are all instincts that real vampires have. And according to my investigation, to become a believer of the blood cult, the sacrificial ritual requires offering blood and changing the holy blood. These lunatics must have regarded the blood of ancestral vampires as the supreme treasure. Blade, Eric, stood beside the metal round table with his arms crossed. The sunglasses on his face made it difficult to see his eyes and complexion clearly. David, notify the Action Department of Imperial Heavy Industries, and transfer a batch of silver items and high-power ultraviolet lamps to the gang of dogs to identify the identities of civilians. At the same time, notify Bucky that from the time the two teams meet and approach the slums, they only have 72 hours. Luo Sha, squinting his eyes, looked at Iron Man David and said in a deep voice. At that time, how many civilians they can evacuate while withstanding the blood cult's offensive pressure will depend on their ability. And when the time is up, they must all retreat. Even if they can save more people, they must leave. Understood, my lord. Iron Man David, with blue light flickering in his eye sockets, shook his metal head slightly. He immediately sent Luo Sha's orders to the distant team through the network. At this moment, the entire brightly lit hall seemed to fall into a state of silence. Whether it was Luo Sha, wearing power armor and sitting next to the metal round table, or Blade, who stood aside with his arms crossed, no one had any intention of speaking. Only Iron Man David occasionally reported to everyone the location and time spent by the second team. Luo Sha hadn't completely told Blade, Eric, his true intentions. But Eric seemed to have guessed part of the truth from the 72-hour time limit. However, unexpectedly, Luo Sha didn't receive any questions from Blade, Eric. The other party seemed to be using silence to tacitly approve of Luo Sha's series of actions towards the slums. Eric, how many years have you been hunting those aliens, those supernatural monsters? At this moment, Luo Sha suddenly took the initiative to break the silence. He turned his head and asked Eric, how many years? To be honest, even I can't remember it clearly. Probably started when I was a teenager. In short, after so many years of hunting and fighting. Although I admit that there are some old guys among those supernatural monsters who have higher morals than humans. Most of them are a bunch of crazy scum who need to be eradicated. So, the only lesson I've learned is that when facing monsters, don't hesitate, even if the battle causes greater casualties. Blade, Eric, wearing sunglasses, seemed to have emptied his mind. He stared at the slightly reflective metal tabletop in front of him without moving. Even his words seemed to be full of reminiscence for the past, yet also seemed to have hidden meanings. Don't hesitate, huh? Luo Sha, tilting his neck back, raised an eyebrow. He understood the meaning hidden behind the other party's words. My lord. Someone else has come to a tunnel outside the base, and you even know him. At this moment, Iron Man David, slightly raising his metal head, suddenly looked at Luo Sha's position and said. Luo Sha, frowning tightly, couldn't help but blink his eyes. He asked in an unkind tone. Who is it? Don't tell me it's another mage from Kamar Taj. No, my lord. Tony Stark has come to the door. Accompanying the heavy metal door, there were subtle sounds of mechanical valves turning inside. With an expressionless face, Luo Sha drove the blue power armor and slowly stepped out of the base. At this moment, he flipped open the visor of the armor. Tony, who was devouring a cheeseburger, skillfully waved his arm encased in the armor. He hurriedly swallowed a mouthful of food. He said to Luo Sha, who was several heads taller than him, hi, friend. I brought you a cheeseburger. You must try this place's craftsmanship, it's absolutely amazing. Tony, I'm not in the mood to joke with you right now, what do you want? Luo Sha, with an indifferent expression, shifted his gaze. He lowered his head and looked down at Tony standing not far away. He asked in a tone without any emotional fluctuations. I've been staying in Stark Tower for too long recently. Jarvis suggested I go out and get some sun. Just right. I noticed your flying vehicle running back and forth over the city a few times, so I thought about visiting you. After all, we are considered neighbors now, right? It's just that I like high-rise buildings, and you like underground facilities. Tony, who was holding a large pile of cheeseburgers in his other hand, raised his eyebrows slightly. He stared at the blue power armor close at hand with a smile, and continued. Oh, actually, I think it's pretty good that the armor is painted blue, and it looks more concise and capable than the previous set. Is your technical bureaucrat planning to upgrade it? Hearing Tony's series of words, Luo Sha, with an indifferent look in his eyes, suddenly took a few steps forward. He stared at Tony condescendingly and said lightly, Tony, I said, I'm not in the mood to joke with you right now. If you have something to say, say it. If not, then get out of here. Tisk, friend, it seems like you're really in a bad mood right now, so I won't beat around the bush. I came out to change my mood. I'm afraid that if I stay at home for too long and read too many confidential documents, I'll want to destroy S.H.I.E.L.D. right away. Also, I really came with the intention of visiting you. Jarvis suggested that I seriously make some friends. Moreover, I guess you might be encountering some difficulties now. As the world's first superhero, as long as it's not just killing and arson, how about I work for you for free? Perhaps sensing the emotional fluctuations beneath Luo Sha's indifferent expression, which were surging like a volcano about to erupt. Tony's expression gradually became serious and he said in a serious tone. After listening to Tony's explanation, Luo Sha, squinting his eyes and carefully sizing up the other party, took a deep breath. He was silent for a moment, then suddenly said to Tony, Tony, you can come in, but don't regret what you are about to see. Regret? What's there to regret about this? You do good things, I help with all my strength. If you do bad things, I'll just fight you. No one stipulates that superheroes have to succeed every time they go on a mission, right, friend? Tony, with a playful smile, raised his chin slightly and said to Luo Sha. The neatly trimmed mustache seemed to glow faintly under the light of the passageway. Luo Sha, with an indifferent expression, stared at the other party one last time. He drove the power armor and turned to walk towards the interior of the base. However, the base's open metal door did not close immediately. Tony, wearing the armor, glanced left and right. He shrugged his shoulders with a helpless expression. He walked into the base carrying a large pile of cheeseburgers. 15 minutes later, sitting next to the metal round table, Tony stared solemnly at the battle images projected from Iron Man David's eye sockets. Those were the data screens left behind the last time the group evacuated from the slums. At this moment, having been repeatedly explained by Blade Warrior and Iron Man David, Tony, who fully understood what had happened, subconsciously wanted to gnaw on his fingernails. When he realized that his fingers were still wrapped in the armor shell, Tony, with a frown, couldn't help but let out a sigh. "Ah, my dear friend, I suddenly remembered that the natural gas pipeline in Stark Tower was left open. Can I leave for a while?" "What do you think, superhero?" Luo Sha, who swallowed a cheeseburger in just one bite, stared at the other party with an expressionless face and said lightly. Perhaps because he was replacing someone else's anxiety, Luo Sha's super appetite was actually opened up. He picked up another cheeseburger, tore open the wrapper on it and took a bite. Then, he said to Tony, who looked worried, "There are still a few hours, my people will arrive at the edge of the slums, and the evacuation operation will officially begin. If you have any better methods and plans than now, you are welcome to speak freely, we are all ears." "Let me think, with my business connections and superhero status, I can launch a large-scale joint operation through official channels and S.H.I.E.L.D. Facing supernatural monsters, they should be able to put aside their past differences." Tony, with a frown, pondered for a moment. He quickly organized his words and said to everyone. However, before Tony could finish speaking, Luo Sha, who couldn't help but sneer, stopped the action of stuffing cheeseburgers into his mouth. He stared at the other party and said coldly, "Hey, Tony, the officials here can't wait for the Mexicans to die clean. Moreover, the people in the slums are all poor people and gang members. Spend countless money and manpower to save a group of pitiful worms with no profit to be gained. Do you believe this yourself when you say it? Time. What we lack most now is time. The people in the blood sector, not NPCs in the game, they all have legs. Some people even have wings. Once they realize that the battlefield situation is unfavorable to them, won't those guys run away?" Luo Sha's words made the expression on Tony's face change several times. The next second, as if being stimulated by a rebellious emotion, Tony took a deep breath and continued to quibble. "There will always be people among Nick Fury's S.H.I.E.L.D. agents who are willing to lend a hand, right? Even Hydra doesn't want to occupy a world occupied by vampires, right? Hydra's ideology is the order they control, not the chaos of monsters running rampant. We can completely use their manpower. Okay, even if the above plan doesn't work, we can also recruit some guys with superpowers. This time, whether they are good or bad, they can join in. Good people can be persuaded by the promise of saving humanity, and bad people can be directly hired with money. I can bear all the expenses in the action. Tony Stark, you fucking wake up a bit. And put away your condescending, disgusting attitude. That's a slum with 1 million people. There are as many as 500,000 infected followers. How many people can you recruit? 20, 50, 100. What's the use of a drop in the bucket? A bunch of untrained and undisciplined people, stepping onto the battlefield easily is just going to die. Not to mention going to deal with a group of damned aliens." At this moment, Luo Sha, whose expression became ferocious, suddenly stood up. His hands were support on the metal round table. A pair of cyan wolf eyes stared at Tony with an expressionless face and roared, "I decided that letting you into the base was a huge mistake. Still a fucking superhero. I think it's a super idiot. This is a war of life and death. A war to eliminate aliens. Not a hero's play where you can make a dashing appearance. Do you understand, Mr. Tony Stark?" The sky in Mexico was somewhat gloomy. It felt like a heavy rain, brewing for a long time, was about to arrive. Beneath the shadow of a large transport truck, Molten silver liquid churned continuously in a makeshift crucible hammered together from carapace armor. At this moment, old John, his white beard neatly trimmed, was using his newly installed mechanical arm to effortlessly stir the boiling, bubbling metal solution. Afterward, he picked up a melee weapon cast from plasteel, shaped almost exactly like a Katachan jungle knife, and began the silver plating process. Looking around, hundreds of silver-plated plasteel knives had already been laid out around old John. Just then, Bucky, his eye sockets painted black with grease paint, walked over to old John. He didn't speak immediately, but squatted down, staring in a slight daze at the repetitive manual labor. "Kid, what are you spacing out for? Have the personnel and supplies been checked?" Old John scolded Bucky without looking up. "With your attitude right now, if you were in the Shola Saikana, you'd be getting a good whipping. Old geezer, can't I even clear my head for a bit?" Bucky rolled his eyes at old John, annoyed, after snapping out of it. He paused for a moment, then said in a low voice, "David told me that this is going to be a very difficult mission. We need to rely on 1,000 people, including the servo-automata, to fight against an almost infinite number of fanatical cultists, while also evacuating innocent civilians. I'm just afraid that by the end of the battle, there won't be many brothers left beside me." Hearing Bucky's demoralized words, old John, who was silver-plating the plasteel knife, suddenly stopped his work. He turned his head to glance at Bucky, saying grumpily, "Why don't you go ask those youngsters right now, if any of them have any thoughts of backing down? In the past, they were just a bunch of good-for-nothing thugs. It was Rorschach who gathered them together, gave them the best training and treatment, strengthened their bodies, and upgraded their weapons and equipment. Isn't it all for a situation like today? That Rorschach is still too young. Back when us old guys followed Allfather Odin to fight in the Nine Realms, similar situations happened more than once, but Allfather Odin didn't hesitate much before launching devastating, terrifying attacks. Don't even mention a few 100,000 people. What does it matter if a planet is destroyed? If it weren't for the decisive decisions back then, where would Allfather Odin be today? How can this be the same? Back then, you guys were conquering the Nine Realms, you were invaders. We're eliminating Xenos now, saving humanity. There's no comparison, from the root to the meaning." Bucky frowned slightly and slowly stood up. He retorted to old John, "And, judging from the 72-hour time limit, I think the captain has already made that preparation. I mean, the preparation for large-scale destruction. So, we must hold on until the end, to save." However, just as Bucky was about to continue speaking, a series of violent sounds of wheels crushing the ground clearly entered his ears. "David said the servo-automata and fighter servitors have arrived." Bucky muttered to himself and suddenly took a deep breath. He raised his neck and shouted loudly at the gloomy sky, "All units, assemble. Prepare for battle. Dash 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 dash." Inside the brightly lit base hall, Tony, who had just been thoroughly scolded by Rorschach, had instead become completely silent. He sat in front of the metal round table, his brows tightly knitted, lost in thought. His listless gaze stared blankly at the series of real-time images that Iron Man David was gradually projecting from his eye sockets. It was the scene of the two teams that had just completed their rendezvous and were making their final preparations. At this moment, more than 500 servo-automata had all been re-equipped with ultraviolet lamps. The gang members wearing carapace armor also casually inspected their silver-plated melee weapons and then stuck them behind their waists. At the same time, a flamethrower had also been completely distributed to each squad. Once everything was completed, Bucky, with a solemn expression, and old John, wearing heavy carapace armor, stood at the front of the entire team. They didn't speak, but only raised their hands to tap their metal helmets, sending a signal to Iron Man David, who was remotely monitoring them. At the same time, Iron Man David walked to Rorschach's side. It shook its metal head and leaned slightly, saying to Rorschach, "My lord, the network signal is still relatively clear. You can speak to them now." I know." Rorschach took a deep breath and stood up from beside the metal round table. He stared at the live scene projected above the metal round table and said in a deep voice, "This is the underground base. I am your commander-in-chief, Rorschach. Today, all of you will face an extremely difficult war. Everyone you see afterward may be an enemy of the Xenos cult, or perhaps just an innocent civilian. Even if you are fully prepared, you will encounter even more complex environments and situations. Some of you will die today, die on the battlefield, die in a foreign land. I could have avoided letting you step onto the battlefield. A tactical nuclear weapon could easily solve the current problem, but I still did this because I don't want the words and slogans that I personally told you to become complete lies. You are humanity's first line of defense against countless crises. We are fighting to save humanity's future. And every person you save today will be humanity's future. Every drop of blood you shed today will not be easily wasted. They may be just a group of pitiful, tragic poor people in the eyes of others, but in my eyes, they should be treated equally. They have only one identity. That is, human. And today, we fight for humanity once again. For humanity. For the Emperor. At this moment, as Rorschach's powerful and forceful words echoed inside and outside the screen, every gang member thousands of miles away subconsciously straightened their spines. Even Eric, the Blade Warrior, sitting beside the metal round table, and Tony, with a solemn expression, breathed a little heavier. And just as everyone's attention was completely focused on the projected image and Rorschach. Click. The exquisitely crafted bolter and plasma pistol in the armory suddenly trembled. Then, wisps of ethereal black mist quickly emerged from inside the weapons, gradually condensing into a golden suit of power armor. Holding a huge power claw in his hand, an illusory figure. At this moment, she stood quietly in the empty armory. Her invisible gaze seemed to penetrate the heavy barriers of the metal walls. Seeing Rorschach, who subconsciously raised his armored arm and roared in anger. On that blurred and hazy illusory face, a fleeting, faint smile seemed to be faintly revealed. Z, for, Z, Humanity, Z. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. The edge of the slums. Automated servo robots, each equipped with ultraviolet lamps, rapidly entered the narrow, damp, and filthy streets. And arriving with their movements were gang members wielding laser weapons or flamethrowers, and silver-plated sabers at their waists. The next second, the piercing wail of an air raid siren echoed through most of the slums. Civilians, drawn by the air raid siren, walked out of their homes with blank expressions, slowly gathering together. They widened their eyes, warily examining the mysterious group that had appeared before them. At the same time, a significant portion of the automated servo robots, divided into 50 teams, abruptly jumped onto the surrounding low and dilapidated buildings. Heavy logging guns swept the area below from a high vantage point. However, no matter how sharp and piercing the air raid sirens repeatedly played by the automated servo robots, or how earnestly the gang members tried to persuade them, the civilians, who remained silent, simply stared warily at the people before them, without taking any action or making any movement. Precious time was slipping away. Just as Bucky, with a furrowed brow, was in urgent communication with the leaders of the gang member teams. Old John, wearing a set of heavy carapace armor and wielding a silver-plated saber, suddenly charged out of the group. He grabbed a young man who was about to turn and leave from among the onlookers. The closer the silver-plated saber in Old John's grip got to the man, the more panicked the young man's expression became. Sizzle, sizzle, sizzle. Until the silver-plated saber was firmly pressed against his flesh. It emitted a terrifying sound like iron being scorched. And accompanied by wisps of rising, foul-smelling smoke and the young man's intense screams. The expressionless Old John suddenly brought his saber down. He chopped off the man's entire head. We come for the blood cult. And to save you. This is a war of life and death, a war without end. For yourself and your families, run. Run. Slightly bending down to pick up the still snarling, fresh head. Old John, holding the enemy's head high, had a voice so loud that it even drowned out the intermittent air raid siren. It seemed that Old John's act of beheading had reminded the onlookers. Or perhaps the blood cult's long-standing reputation had instilled fear in their hearts. In any case, the civilians, with their varied expressions, were willing to follow the gang members' quick arrangements. After repeatedly being checked by ultraviolet lamps and silver-plated sabers, they chose to leave the dilapidated streets of the slums and run towards the outside. In a short time, the entire evacuation operation rapidly unfolded, extending into the interior of the slums. If nothing unexpected happened, Before the Blood Cult's core forces could fully react, the gang members were confident that they could completely evacuate everyone in the area. Clack, clack, clack. However, accompanied by the rapid turning of the heavy logging guns of the automated servo robots, and the enemy attack alerts issued by the automated machine bees hovering in the gloomy sky and acting as reconnaissance eyes, mindless civilians wearing red cloaks gradually appeared within the gang members' line of sight. Enemy contact ahead. A gang member team quickly led several teams of automated servo robots forward, forming a mobile defensive line that could gradually advance. The next second, the tearing roar of the heavy logging guns once again echoed in the sky above the slums, accompanied by the frantic sweeping of scorching lasers and solid bullets. The attacking force of mindless civilians was temporarily suppressed in the narrow, damp streets. The intense gunfire caused a slight commotion among the civilians who had initially chosen to observe. They did not show much panic. Instead, they began to pour out of the low buildings in large numbers, voluntarily running towards the outside of the slums. This undoubtedly caused some trouble for the gang members' evacuation operation. They simply could not distinguish whether there were blood cult believers hidden among the civilians. The automated servo robots occupying the high ground continue to turn on the ultraviolet lamps. Sniper teams prioritize focusing on blood cult believers mixed in with the civilians. Only join the battle in front after high-value targets appear. Send out a team of automated servo robots to quickly level the nearby buildings. We need a wider field of fire. Establish more gradually advancing combat lines. Bucky, quickly scanning the surrounding environment, immediately issued orders to everyone through the communication channel. At this moment, as an increasing number of mindless civilians surged towards this place, priests wearing red robes and believers holding firearms also began to appear behind the enemy's ranks. The automated servo robots reacted faster than the gang members. The bullet storm from the heavy logging guns had already cut through the air, launching a sweeping attack on those high-value targets. At the same time, with the entire line established by Bucky, and the gradual advance of all teams, many civilians who had been trapped at home by the intense firefight also ran out of their hiding places. Some of these people not only did not immediately turn around and flee, but instead, with the old firearms in their hands, helped the gang members launch a sustained counterattack against the blood cult. Bucky quickly ordered a gang member team to take over the command authority of this group of civilians. Women and children mixed in were to be evacuated as soon as possible, leaving the men under the command of the gang members, becoming a reserve force for the advancing line. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. At this moment, some blood cult believers hidden among the mindless civilians suddenly raised rocket launchers on their shoulders. With fanatical expressions, they launched a terrifying bombardment against the lines that the gang members were trying to build. Even though the automated servo robots reacted quickly and rapidly shot down a considerable number of rockets in midair by adjusting the muzzles of the heavy logging guns, there were still many rockets that passed through the dense fire net and landed within the gang members' lines. Boom, boom, boom. In an instant, not only did the unprotected civilians suffer heavy casualties, but even some gang members wearing carapace armor were knocked to the ground by the violent explosions. They stubbornly endured with their tenacious willpower, gritting their teeth to avoid completely passing out. At the same time, accompanied by the scalding blood constantly flowing between the ground, some priests whose bodies had been crushed by the heavy logging guns reformed into blood-colored human figures. Streams of blood, like throwing knives, gradually appeared above the enemy's ranks in a series of vague and sharp chants. Sniper teams immediately take out those who launch the rockets. Try to stop the priests from casting magic. Gang member teams equipped with flamethrowers, prepare to move forward. Burn everything in front of you to the ground. Bucky, shaking his head desperately to stay awake, roared into the communication device through gritted teeth. The next moment, behind the mobile barrier established by the automated servo robots with their metal bodies, gang members holding flamethrowers quickly revealed their tall figures. They slightly raised the narrow nozzles of the flamethrowers and abruptly pulled the triggers. In an instant, terrifying flames, tens of meters long, suddenly pierced through the air filled with heavy blood, heavily drawing a beautiful arc, burning towards those who were stepping on the mountain of broken corpses accumulated between the ground. Continuing to surge forward, the mindless civilians. Inside the brightly lit base hall, clear images above the metal round table were presented to everyone. At this moment, only 6 hours had passed since the evacuation operation began. The entire combat team had only advanced about 3 kilometers, barely maintaining 2 lines of defense. The estimated number of civilians who have been evacuated is between 1 and 2,000. If you include the number of people who fled on their own, then the data can be close to 50,000. But for the slums with hundreds of thousands of civilians, everything is just beginning. Moreover, the blood worship cult seemed to have discovered the ultimate purpose of the combat team. They massacred innocent people by cruel means to deter civilians who had not yet escaped, and used the prestige accumulated over the years to bewitch all civilians. The combat team that is attacking is a bad guy who is driving them away from their homes, using the blind mentality of the civilians to drive them to voluntarily become mindless people. Towards the front of the line, they filled up the cannon fodder for the attack. My lord, the gang dogs have not yet suffered any casualties, but the number of seriously injured has increased to 23. The loss of automatic servo robots is not significant. Only 50 or so have temporarily withdrawn from the battle due to various mechanical failures or gun overheating, and are undergoing self-repair. 56 heavy combat aircraft servants have not yet entered the battlefield. The unlocking authority has been handed over to Bucky and Old John, allowing them to independently judge the battlefield situation and release the combat aircraft servants. However, with the mobilization of the blood worship cult, a considerable number of civilians have been completely bewitched into mindless people, and the more ferocious our killing is, the more blood flows between the ground, and some blood sacrifice priests who have lost their physical confinement can take advantage of the convenience of this special environment, and they are using a lot of blood to perform some strange blood magic. Of course, our combat team has discovered the combat methods to resist these guys, either using flamethrowers to burn corpses and evaporate blood, or using laser weapons to focus fire on a blood-colored humanoid priest. Their so-called immortal body has a limit to the number of times it can be recondensed, and at most 3 or 4 times it will be assimilated by blood and become a pool of blood slime that can only squirm. Old John is forming a beheading squad using freezing grenades. He plans to find the enemy's real commander in order to reduce the pressure on the team to face the enemy head-on. Iron Man David, whose eyes were constantly reflecting real-time images, stood motionless beside the metal round table. He reported any combat situation to Luo Sha and the 2 people around him non-stop. Dong dong dong. Luo Sha, with an indifferent expression, repeatedly tapped the smooth, reflective tabletop with a metal finger, making a series of dull metal collision sounds. Rumble. At this moment, perhaps due to the continuous influence of the noise on Luo Sha's hands, or perhaps he could no longer bear the death of innocent civilians in the real-time images, Tony, who was controlling the armor, stood up abruptly and walked towards the base passage with a blank expression. Tony, what are you planning to do? Luo Sha's indifferent voice clearly reached Tony's ears. I don't want to sit here and watch. I want to go to the scene to help. Even if I can only save one person, I am willing. Tony, whose carefully trimmed mustache seemed to twitch slightly, said without looking back. Save your energy. Facing a large-scale war to eliminate aliens, even if you go up, you won't be able to play a greater role. It's nothing more than reducing the casualties of some soldiers and inspiring the morale of the people, but this is also their responsibility and the purpose of my training them. Luo Sha squinted his eyes and said in a calm tone. However, Luo Sha's words seemed to anger Tony. He saw him drive the armor and suddenly turned around. A pair of white eyes seemed to show streaks of blood. Damn it. There is no such thing as a responsibility to bear. Why can you send your subordinates to their deaths? You. Tony, you are not a soldier, nor a warrior. You may never understand what responsibility is, what sacrifice is, but at least you must learn basic respect. Luo Sha, who was sitting next to the metal round table, did not show any signs of anger. He still said in a calm tone. I told you a long time ago, Tony, everything you see when you enter the base will far exceed your concepts and imagination. You insisted on coming in yourself. Anger, shame, fear. These are normal physiological reactions when facing this kind of war situation. After you become a superhero, you may have seen many tragic events, and you also have a conscience that wants to do good, but you have not really stepped onto the terrifying battlefield where you die or I live. Sacrifice, loyalty, and fighting to the death are the ultimate destination of human warriors. Tony, if you want to end this matter as soon as possible and save more humans. Do you see the passage over there? On the third floor underground, my technical bureaucrats may need your help to play your talent as a technology genius and make your own contribution to this war. It equals, Z Syot, href equals, tomato. As soon as Luo Shah's voice fell, Tony, who took a few deep breaths, seemed to control the intense emotional fluctuations in his heart. He stared deeply at Luo Shah, who had no expression on his face. He resolutely floated and flew towards the forging workshop on the third floor underground. My lord, I have already notified Laoditus that there will be helpers going there. But your actions just now, will they? Iron Man David, whose eyes were reflecting real-time images, said in a low voice to Luo Shah. David, I know what you mean. However, Tony will not become a threat to us. His character is indeed bad, but I believe in his conscience. He has not yet escaped the heavy shackles of superheroes and truly grown up. So, I gave him a chance, and I will continue to give him more opportunities in the future, depending on how he understands and digests those things. Luo Shah, who squinted his eyes slightly, said to Iron Man David in a calm tone. At this moment, Blade Warrior Eric, who was sitting opposite the metal round table, seemed to re-examine Luo Shah through his sunglasses. But he has always been taciturn and does not have much outward emotion. Luo Shah was too lazy to guess what the other party was thinking. My lord, according to my calculations, the first 24 hours are not a big problem for the gang dogs. But the number of civilians they can evacuate will definitely become less and less. According to my continuous deduction of the current battlefield situation, after 72 hours, we can only evacuate 200,000 people at most. The blood worship cult's control over the slums is far tighter than we expected. Only 200,000, Luo Shah murmured in a low voice before falling into silence. Then, he straightened his spine abruptly and slowly stood up, driving the blue power armor. David, load the Valkyrie transport plane with land raiders. At the same time, use the automatic machine bees on the battlefield to find the location of the blood worship cult's lair as much as possible. I want to personally give them an appetizer gift before the extermination order feast. As the dim night gradually swallowed the last trace of light, the front lines of the slum were almost as bright as day. Countless burning, low-rise buildings resembled vibrant torches, illuminating everything around them. With an indifference expression, Bucky lay prone behind a trench that had just been dug by an automated servo robot. He chewed on a protein energy bar while listening to the detailed reports from the reconnaissance team. At this point, the combat teams had penetrated nearly 10 kilometers into the slums, evacuating an estimated 80 to 90,000 people, and about 12 hours had passed since the operation began. Just half an hour before nightfall, countless mind-lost heart citizens and fanatical believers controlled by the blood worship sect seemed to enter a state of hibernation, temporarily withdrawing from the front lines and disappearing. This undoubtedly provided the gang dogs' combat teams with an extremely valuable opportunity to catch their breath. Some of the automated servo robots in the reserve teams also took this opportunity to transport large quantities of ammunition, food, and fresh water to the exhausted troops. Bucky also quickly dispatched several reconnaissance teams, voluntarily led by local civilians, deeper into the slums. One was to cooperate with the continuous exploration of the automatic machine drones to find the command echelon of the blood worship sect that had been hiding. The second was to see if they could find easier and faster escape routes for those civilians who were intimidated by the blood worship sect and had not yet fled. Okay, I understand, be careful, and don't engage the enemy if you encounter them. Try to ensure the safety of yourselves and the civilian guides. Bucky quickly hung up the communication device. He struggled to swallow the last bite of the protein energy bar in his mouth. Feeling thirsty, he barely moistened his dry throat with the saliva that had just been secreted. Afterward, Bucky smacked his lips at the taste. He turned his head and said to Old John, who was sitting in the trench sharpening a silver-plated saber. Old man, according to the reconnaissance team's report, the blood worship sect's believers are performing their daily routine of prayer rituals. We have at least half an hour to rest. Moreover, mixed formations of Mexican military police have appeared in other directions of the slums, but they haven't dared to enter this area. Instead, they've been trying to meet a lot of people who are desperately fleeing the slums during the prayer rituals. That's good news. This undoubtedly reduces the pressure on us to evacuate civilians, meaning we're not fighting alone. We can also focus most of our attention on how to deal with the blood worship sect, by the way, has this information been compiled and sent to David's side? At this moment, old John's heavy carapace armor was covered in the fishy smell blood of enemies and bullet-scraping marks. Even his neatly trimmed snow-white beard was almost dyed dark red. Without even raising his head, he carefully polished the silver-plated saber in his hand and asked softly in Bucky's direction. At the same time, Bucky, who was lying on the edge of the trench, turned his head to the side. First, he revealed half of one eye. He vigilantly observed the front lines, which were only filled with corpses and fire, without any other movement. Then, he carefully retracted his body. Turning his head, he looked at the various supplies thrown inside the trench, wanting to find a bottle of fresh water to quench his thirst. Hearing old John's question, and feeling increasingly parched, Bucky said without thinking, "It was reported long ago. Besides, David built the communication network, how could he not know? Didn't David say that we should make our own decisions on battlefield command? Don't worry, however, David has taken over some of the automatic machine drones and is looking for the blood worship sect's real nest. It seems our dear captain can't sit still again. Can't he stay in the base and be a proper commander for once? Old man, give me a bottle of the bottled fresh water you're sitting on." As soon as Bucky finished speaking, a bottle of crystal clear bottled fresh water was forcefully pulled out from under old John's butt and thrown over. Instinctively swallowing a few mouthfuls of saliva, Bucky quickly caught it firmly with his metallic arm. He twisted open the bottle cap and took several large gulps, letting out a contented burp. Belch. TCH, you think little Rorschach is you. His potential is as deep and profound as the god King Odin, unlike you, who is still like a snot-nosed kid even at your age. Raising the polished silver-plated saber, old John nodded in satisfaction after observing the blade a few times. He deftly put the saber back into its sheath at his waist. Then, old John, turning his gaze, glanced sideways at Bucky, who was closing his eyes to rest, and said in a tone of disappointment, "I've killed more than a dozen blood worship sect priests today. If things go smoothly, killing their bishop or something wouldn't be difficult. When we hold the victory celebration, everyone will come to congratulate me. Don't be envious. You are the Asgardian reckless general, and I am the human cautious little marshal. Our battlefield positioning is different. I'm just trying to bring everyone home safely while completing the mission. As for how many enemies we can kill and how much credit we can get, there's no difference." Bucky, with his eyes tightly closed, said playfully in a calm tone. Then, his voice seemed to grow weaker and weaker, as if he were gradually falling asleep. Old John, sitting in the shadows of the trench, raised his mechanical arm and scratched his slightly itchy dark red beard. He stared intently at Bucky, who had fallen asleep. A kind smile subconsciously appeared on the corner of his mouth. However, before long, the kind smile on the corner of old John's mouth almost disappeared. He suddenly stood up. His slightly narrowed one eye stared intently at the dark night sky above the slums, and he gasped. At this moment, it seemed that dozens of shadowy giant figures were rapidly approaching the front lines of the position outside the range of the firelight. "Bucky boy, stop sleeping. The enemy's Air Force is coming to attack. Little bastards. Are you all fed and watered? Grip your laser weapons tightly, and get your spirits up. Show some spirit. Valhalla doesn't welcome your visits yet. And you automatic kids, stand up for me too. Point all your guns at the sky. If you can't shoot down an enemy, I'll tear you apart." In an instant, accompanied by old John's loud voice, the inside of the previously silent trench seemed to quickly come alive. 4 lines of defense, from high to low, gradually appeared below the night sky of the slums. The gang dogs squatting in the trenches rubbed their hands and changed the energy magazines of their laser weapons. They also opened the extremely rare number of thermostatic devices, revealing the frozen grenades inside. At the same time, automated servo robots quickly jumped out of their hidden positions. They occupied the pre-planned firepower points, high points, and other important places in batches, making all combat preparations. The next second, heavy logging guns located above the metal carapaces automatically loaded ammunition. The black muzzles were raised slightly, firmly locking onto the dark night sky. Da. In an instant, dazzling trajectories composed of solid bullets forcibly tore through the night sky. The intense roar, like a logging machine, completely broke the silence above the battlefield. Every heavy logging gun autonomously controlled by an automated servo robot. unhesitatingly fired terrifying and dense bullet storms at the vampires who had lowered their altitude. Even though the vampires struggled to flap the huge fleshy wings behind them, their blood-colored bodies also dodged flexibly in the air. However, the terrifying firepower network composed of countless large-caliber solid bullets was not something that could be easily broken through. In the blink of an eye, 2/3 of the dozens of flying vampires were torn into pieces of flesh and blood in midair by the bullet storm. The remaining air force had no choice but to crash heavily into the fire-filled slums. However, before the gang dogs, who had made aiming movements, could pull the triggers of their laser weapons, trying to annihilation the struggling vampires from a distance. Boom! Accompanied by a series of echoing roars and dazzling firelight. All the vampires, whose blood-colored bodies were covered with terrifying bullet marks, immediately exploded on a large scale. Flying ghost meat bombs. I really admire the enemy commander for coming up with such a ghost idea. Bucky, who was observing the situation on the front lines, subconsciously uttered a murmur. Then, he immediately turned his head and shouted at Old John. Old man, while the enemy's surprise attack is ineffective and the ground forces have not coordinated a response, we need to advance the overall line of defense again. Let's see how far we can advance tonight. Bucky boy, you're the commander. I'll listen to you. I'll just kill to my heart's content. Old John nodded heavily, grinning can't help it. He casually picked up a shotgun, a specialty of the hive gangs, from the supplies in the trench. Then, Old John, wearing heavy carapace armor, suddenly jumped onto the top of the trench. Turning his head, he shouted loudly at the position behind him. Bring a team of little cubs who aren't afraid of death and like close combat. Let's go pierce the enemy's ass. As soon as Old John finished speaking, more than 20 gang dogs wearing carapace armor jumped out of the trench and followed behind the old man. The next moment, this assault team, with Old John as its spearhead, immediately crossed the front lines, launching a rapid and powerful advance into the depths of the slums. At the same time, inside the trench located on the fourth line of defense, a mixed team composed of a group of male civilians from the slums and a gang dog squad also followed Bucky's command. They gripped the newly replenished laser weapons tightly and crawled forward toward the trench position on the third line of defense. The gang dog squad in the third trench, under the cover of more automated servo robots, quickly got up and ran toward the second trench further ahead. At this moment, if someone could look down from the sky above the slums, they could clearly see that the entire combat team was actually using a bizarre wave-like method, continuously launching attacks deeper into the slums. Metal pellets from the shotgun brutally shattered the emaciated bodies of several mind-lost civilians. Some of the penetrating metal pellets also quickly embedded themselves in the body of a blood-offering priest, before the opponent could react to the pain from the gunshot wound. Old John, who had casually drawn a silver-plated military knife from behind his waist, charged towards the enemy like a fierce old lion. With a swift motion, he beheaded the blood-offering priest with a single strike. Then, with nimble movements, Old John didn't even give the opponent a chance to condense a blood-colored figure from the stinking blood all over the ground. Crack! A freezing grenade with its ring removed flew rapidly from his palm. The ground within a few meters was instantly covered with blood-colored ice spikes pointing upwards. The ubiquitous extreme cold also quickly destroyed the special activity within the nearby blood, completely depriving the blood-offering priest of his only means of revival. And with the true death of this blood-offering priest before his eyes, the mind-lost civilians controlled by him also completely stopped their offensive actions. They either stood in place with blank expressions, slowly shedding tears of blood, or instantly collapsed to the ground and died, losing all signs of life. Alas, even though I have witnessed it countless times, I still can't bear to see these civilians shedding tears of blood. Lads, give them a quick end. Old John shook his head slightly and took a deep breath of the foul air. With a heavy expression, he turned his head and softly shouted at the gang dogs surrounding the battlefield. Upon hearing Old John's order, more than 20 gang dogs quickly sheathed their silver-plated military knives. They raised their laser guns again and unhesitatingly pulled the triggers. CHZZ, CHZZ, CHZZ. Streams of hot laser light, a mixture of blue and red, easily pierced through the flesh and blood of a large number of mind-lost civilians, also ending their prolonged suffering. This area should be clear now, let's temporarily stop advancing and wait for the teams behind to catch up. This time we've gone too far into the slums. Search the surrounding buildings horizontally. If you find any civilians inside, evacuate them as soon as possible. No need to regroup with me." Old John, his crimson beard twitching slightly, scanned the unfamiliar surroundings with his one eye. He raised his mechanical arm, clenched into a fist, and waved it forcefully. After the gang dogs, divided into groups of 5, quickly dispersed towards the surrounding low buildings. Old John, his expression much more relaxed, suddenly took out some ammunition from inside his heavy armor. And slowly began reloading his shotgun. Hiss, hiss, hiss. Just at this moment, from the dirty soil around, soaked with the enemy's blood, strands of extremely thin blood silk veins suddenly extended out. These blood silk veins, which seemed to possess special activity, were actually silently gathering towards Old John's location. A Rafat I.Iota. However, just as the extremely insidious blood silk veins were about to reach Old John's feet, Old John, who had just reloaded his shotgun, suddenly jumped up in place, forcefully increasing his height by several meters. At the same time, a freezing grenade, its ring having been pulled at some unknown time, had quietly landed. Crack, accompanied by a crisp cracking sound. Countless outward sloping blood-colored ice spikes erupted like a magnificent flower. The rapidly spreading extreme cold completely covered the area within a few meters, extinguishing those extremely strange blood silk veins. Boom! The combat boots made of armor heavily crushed the blood-colored ice spikes. Old John's tall body crashed to the ground. He blinked his one eye slightly. His cold gaze stared straight at the dim alleyway not far away, and he said with a sneer, "Ha ha, come out, little one, before the last battle ended. I already noticed the bloody scent on you. Otherwise, why would I have let those lads leave early? Wasn't it to reduce their casualties?" As soon as Old John's words fell, a slender Mexican woman, holding a golden scepter in her hand, with a very hot figure, slowly walked out of her hiding place. She was wearing a dark red robe that was obviously more exquisite and gorgeous than the blood-offering priests. Even the open V-neck in front of her revealed a large area of wheat-colored skin. "You are one of the leaders of the invading team. The blue demon who escaped before is also one of yours." The Mexican woman, whose wheat-colored skin on her chest seemed to glow slightly in the night, asked in a calm tone. Her voice seemed to carry an innate sense of superiority. "Oh, after fighting for so long, you still don't know who you're fighting with. Your intelligence is a bit too outdated, right? And how did an old man like me, who just does the hard work, become a leader? Oh right, I have to correct something for that kid Bucky. We are not invaders, but great saviors who are saving humanity. Although I am not a local, if I contribute to this, the knocker on the door to enter Valhalla might become a bit thicker." Old John's neat beard, dyed crimson by blood, twitched a few times. He seriously corrected the errors in the words to the Mexican woman standing not far away. "I don't care who you are. If your combat team chooses to withdraw from the slums now, the blood-offering sect can forgive your rudeness and cruelty. We will also promise to let the remaining civilians go, but it needs to be done gradually according to our methods." The Mexican woman with wheat-colored skin suddenly blinked her pupils, which were gradually turning blood-colored. But she still maintained a calm tone and said to Old John. At this time, Old John suddenly raised his mechanical arm and shook it vigorously. "Wait a minute, let me calculate. Counting the priest I just killed, there have been 15 priests who died at my hands, right? If you count the priests killed by others, you seem to have lost more than 20 middle and upper levels. But I heard that you only have 66 blood-offering priests in total. If it wasn't to save a few more humans, do you think you bunch of bad guys, like Pestheim, could last long?" Old John, grinning, seemed to subconsciously put his mechanical arm on his waist. The shotgun he was tightly gripping in his other palm was also carried on his shoulder armor. Then, he smiled and continued to say to the Mexican woman, whose face suddenly turned gloomy. "So, who are you? Are you the bishop leader of the blood-offering sect? Or the woman in the beds of those sect executives? Go to hell." However, before Old John could finish speaking, the Mexican woman, her face as gloomy as if covered in frost, suddenly raised the golden scepter in her palm. At the same time, a low-pitched but sharp mumbling chant also quickly poured out from her mouth. Almost at the same time, strands of dark red blood, bursting out from the corpses all over the ground, suddenly appeared in midair. Like thin blood arrows, they were forcefully shot towards Old John's location. "Little one, I've been waiting for you." At this moment, Old John's mechanical arm, placed on his waist, quickly raised. The remaining 3 freezing grenades had already been thrown out, violently rolling and flying towards the top of the Mexican woman's head. In the blink of an eye, countless crystal-clear, cold ice spikes erupted. Thin, slender arrows of blood rapidly grazed Old John's thick carapace armor, emitting almost inaudible scraping sounds. The shotgun he tightly gripped in his palm had already dropped from his shoulder armor. Without hesitation, he unleashed a continuous barrage on the Mexican woman in the distance. At the same time, the Mexican woman, almost completely enveloped by the chilling cold of ice, showed no sign of backing down. Shred, accompanied by a series of incredibly eerie sounds of skin tearing. Right behind the smooth, wheat-colored back of the Mexican woman, a pair of enormous blood-red fleshy wings, with a wingspan of nearly 5 meters, instantly burst forth from her curvaceous body. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. In an instant, the blood-red fleshy wings, far surpassing ordinary vampires in both flesh quality and flapping speed, easily blocked the falling icicles and the countless incoming metal pellets. Crackle, however, just as the Mexican woman, with a very gloomy expression, continued to flap her huge blood-red fleshy wings with all her might, trying to quickly dispel the extreme cold spreading around her. Thump thump thump. Old John, whose footsteps were deeply embedded in the soil, had already reached the opponent's proximity. The next second, a silver-plated military knife, suddenly drawn from behind his waist, was forcibly driven into the depths of the Mexican woman's slightly open, delicate lips, with such force that the tip of the knife almost pierced through to the back of her spine. Unfortunately, before Old John could launch another attack, his tall body was heavily struck on the side of his thick carapace armor by a pair of huge blood-red fleshy wings. The whole person flew rapidly towards the nearby building like a deflated ball, only stopping after crashing straight through a half-foot thick concrete wall. Haha, she truly lives up to her reputation as a hot vampire. That was quite a hit. Old John, forcefully pulling half of his body out of the broken wall, couldn't help but burst into hearty laughter. He slightly shook his uninjured head. Thin, dense blood vessels gradually emerged in his only remaining eye, on his face and the exposed, aged skin on the back of his hands. Blue blood vessels, as if about to burst, bulged high, constantly throbbing violently. This was the basic prelude to an Asgardian berserker entering a berserk state. Clang! At the same time, the Mexican woman, standing in place and shaking her fleshy wings, also endured the intense pain. Forcibly pulled the blood-soaked silver-plated military knife from her bleeding mouth. Chi. The plastic steel military knife, its surface seemingly corroded by a layer of silver plating, was casually thrown to the ground by her with an angry expression. Immediately afterwards, the Mexican woman slowly opened her blood-stained lips, wanting to utter the incantations to control magic, but only sputtering out intermittent, vague hisses. Looking at the enemy in the distance displaying such a ridiculous scene, Old John, straining to widen his blood-red eye, couldn't help but grin. Even the deep red beard on his chin seemed to twitch a few times. "Do you know what kind of enemies we berserkers like and fear the most? It's you damned mages?" Old John, his back slightly hunched, forcefully took a step forward. He was about to launch an incredibly fierce charge towards the Mexican woman, who had begun to flap her blood-red fleshy wings and adopted a close combat stance. Just at this moment, Old John, suddenly hearing something from the communication device near his ear, abruptly stopped in his tracks. He quickly crashed headfirst into the wall behind him. His entire body directly retreated into the interior of the building. Boom boom boom. The terrifying roar of the Valkyrie's vector engines, nearing a state of collapse, almost reverberated throughout the entire night sky. A Crusader pattern land raider, weighing over 70 tons, suddenly rushed out of the open cargo bay, forcefully leapt into the 15-meter airspace, and roared towards the ground below like a massive meteorite falling from the sky. And its sole target was the Mexican woman who was trying to flap her blood-red fleshy wings and escape from this place. Rumble, accompanied by the roaring sounds constantly echoing around and the terrifying tremors in the ground. The Mexican woman, who had no time to dodge, was heavily suppressed under the metal tracks of the Crusader pattern land raider. At the same time, as the side hatch of the Crusader pattern Land Raider suddenly opened. Rorschach, wearing blue power armor and carrying a phase sword on his back, stepped back onto the battlefield, holding the blood scythe in his palm. Rorschach, kid, did you have to make such a scary entrance? If I had run a little slower, I would have been crushed too. Old John, slowly walking out of the building, first glanced at the Land Raider, which resembled a small metal mountain. Then, his gaze passed over the flying dust, staring at Rorschach's blue power armor and said loudly, "Grandpa, there's no way around it. I miscalculated the Valkyrie's carrying weight, causing the transport's vector engines to be close to a state of disrepair. If we hadn't dropped the Land Raider in advance, I'm afraid our Valkyrie would have crashed in the slums. It's not completely dead yet? Who is this guy? Doesn't look quite like an ordinary priest." Rorschach, wearing a metal helmet, turned his head and explained a few words to old John. Immediately afterwards, his gaze passed through the helmet's visor and looked towards the Mexican woman, who happened to be crushed nearly halfway by the 13th Aquila track of the Land Raider. Judging from her attire and behavior, she should be one of the high-ranking members of the blood cult, but as for whether she's a bishop or just cannon fodder sent out to negotiate, it's hard to say. Oh, they even wanted to come and seek peace with me before. Old John strode forward. He lowered his head and glanced at the Mexican woman, who was still struggling desperately under the tracks, emitting silent roars, and shook his head, saying, "Because I was wary of those magic tricks, I deliberately ruined her vocal cords, so now even if I wanted to ask, I wouldn't be able to get anything out of her." Whoosh! Hearing old John's words, the blood scythe, held in Rorschach's palm, quickly raised and slashed through the air. The blade of the scythe, emitting a dazzling green light, heavily embedded itself in the center of the Mexican woman's gradually reddening head. Since it's useless to ask, then it's better to kill them all. Rorschach stared at the Mexican woman, who was still twitching violently even with only half of her body remaining. He turned his head and said to old John. The next second, the gradually silent, fragmented corpse also quickly melted into a pool of lifeless, stinky blood. "Get in the vehicle, old John. David has found several suspected locations of the blood cult's lairs. I want to use the Land Raider to launch a surprise attack and try to disrupt their offensive layout, preferably killing most of the high-ranking members, to buy us more time for the evacuation." "Haha, Rorschach, kid, you really can't sit still in the commander's seat. It doesn't matter, there's no reason for an army's general not to be on the battlefield. We Asgardians always take the lead ourselves. Let's go. Let's both of us continue to crush these cowardly bastards who bully the weak and fear the strong." Old John, grinning widely, vigorously patted his thick chest armor, and said with a cold glint in his eyes. From the other side of the slum, the massive sounds of heavy logging guns rang out from time to time. Occasionally, the terrifying flames of flamethrowers would erupt. Iron Man David's towering figure rapidly approached the crash site of the Land Raider. After it plunged headfirst into the interior of the cockpit, accompanied by terrifying roars from the burning engine, like a tiger's howl. The massive metal body, driven by 13 metal treads, struggled to climb out of the huge, meter-deep crater. The incredibly sturdy, sloping front of the vehicle slightly adjusted its direction of travel. Then, without hesitation, it crashed into the nearby buildings. It began a rampage towards the location that had been scouted out in advance. Along the way, anything that dared to stand in front of the Land Raider's black front end, whether it was an empty building or a large group of mindless citizens heading to the front lines for reinforcements, was crushed into countless dust and bloody mud by the massive metal body. Several minutes later, the Land Raider, its metal hull covered in viscous blood, quickly arrived at a location suspected to be an enemy nest. Boom boom boom. The twin-linked assault cannon, personally controlled by Rorschach, completely collapsed most of the building's supporting structure. The Land Raider, its burning engine roaring like a tiger, also began a cruel and merciless crushing spree of the mindless citizens who were climbing out of the building ruins under the control of Iron Man David. At that moment, a blood cult priest, staggering, rushed out of the crumbling building ruins in a disheveled state. The next moment, old John, clutching a phase sword in his palm, and Rorschach, wielding the blood scythe, suddenly leapt out of the Land Raider's hatch. They quickly launched an execution-style charge towards the blood cult priest, who was close at hand. In an instant, countless streams of scalding blood from the mindless citizens soaked Rorschach's blue power armor. A large number of shattered figures flying backward, and scattered limbs and broken arms seemed to leave a terrifying carpet of flesh and blood in front of and behind him. After the blood scythe, radiating a dazzling green light, hooked onto the blood cult priest's chin, completely cleaving the other party's head into pieces. Rorschach, wearing power armor, stood quietly in place, holding the constantly dripping blood scythe in one hand. He patiently waited for the first resurrection of the blood-colored figure. Time passed, and the thick night was gradually receding. The gloomy sky did not clear up. Instead, countless fine rain threads drifted above the slum. They gently merged with the burning buildings, stirring up wisps of choking smoke. At the same time, the light from laser weapons in the distant locations and the tearing gunfire of heavy logging guns hardly stopped all night. The number of mindless citizens, already so large that it was almost impossible to count, mixed with even more fanatical believers, gradually spread across the front lines of the battlefield. They kept roaring, continuously charging like zombies against the increasingly fragile defensive lines due to casualties. Boom, boom, boom in another direction of the slum. The Land Raider, which had been ramming and crashing almost all night, slowly stopped its massive metal body. Rorschach, whose blue power armor had been sprayed with enemy blood into a rainbow color, stepped out of the hatch. He raised his hand and took off the metal helmet, whose visor was covered in dried blood. He took a deep breath of the much fresher air. At the same time, old John, carrying a phase sword on his shoulder armor, also stepped out of the Land Raider's compartment. He tried his best to feel the refreshing sensation brought by the cool rain gently washing his face. Rorschach, boy, we've wiped out more than 20 hidden strongholds that were producing mindless citizens tonight, killed 13 blood cult priests, and also rescued at least 10,000 human civilians who haven't been converted yet. Why do you still look unhappy? Old John, blinking his one eye slightly, turned his head to stare at Rorschach's side face, which had a slightly furrowed brow, and asked in a deep voice. Hearing old John's question, Rorschach, whose brow seemed to twitch slightly, took another deep breath. He slowly said, "Apart from that Mexican woman we killed at the beginning, we haven't found any of the other high-ranking members of the blood cult. This means that those building strongholds in the slum aren't their nests at all. It seems that the real location of their nests should be built underground in the slum. Underground? Otherwise, let's run through it again. Even if it's hidden underground, there should always be an entrance or ventilation device, right? If we look carefully, we should." However, old John's words were interrupted by Rorschach, whose expression became indifferent. He said without hesitation, "Killing the high-ranking members now won't do much good. Even if we kill them all night, you see, the number of mindless citizens hasn't decreased, but has increased instead. This has also led to no small number of casualties on Bucky's side. If he hadn't mobilized the heavy combat servitors in advance, the defensive line he was trying to maintain would have collapsed long ago. And facing the enemy's underground nests, which are connected in all directions, we don't have any more manpower to continue to waste time with the blood cult." Moreover, half an hour ago, Redditus suddenly notified David that, with Tony Stark's full help, the Vondi catalyst used to create a large firestorm has been manufactured in advance and the encapsulation work has been completed. In other words, our large-scale weapon of destruction is already on its way here. Rorschach, boy, have you finally made up your mind? Hearing Rorschach's words, old John, who had been silent for a moment, grinned. He shook his dark red beard, which had been dampened by the fine rain threads, and asked softly, "Actually, I should have made up my mind long ago. It's just that the crazy idea of saving humanity has made me almost recklessly devote myself to it. And I've also ignored the reality. Now that we've done everything we can, we have to make the final choice. We can't completely throw in my already meager assets to save the remaining civilians, can we?" At this moment, Rorschach, who had narrowed his eyes, suddenly said to Iron Man David, who had opened the Land Raider's hatch, "Notify Bucky, let him lead the gang members and the civilians who are willing to help to retreat. Leave the combat servitors and the automatic servo robots that can still fight behind to cover the rear and try to stop the pursuit of the mindless citizens." "Understood, my lord." Iron Man David slightly shook his metal head. He quickly relayed Rorschach's order to Bucky. At this moment, Rorschach, standing in place, subconsciously raised his head. He narrowed his eyes and felt the fine rain threads coming towards him. He seemed to let out a final sigh in his mouth. "Alas, old John, let's go too. Everything here is about to cease to exist." Although there is no emperor in this universe, I still pray that the souls of all the innocent and suffering can eventually return to the Golden Throne. May the Emperor protect us, and may all living beings find rest. Swish, swish, swish. Under the constant teasing of the continuous drizzle. 56 heavy combat servitors clad in thick composite armor were lined up almost in a single row. Occupying the middle position of the front line, streams of red, scorching lasers continuously erupted from their modified arms and the gunports on the sides of their shoulders. Forming a conspicuous laser storm, successively piercing through a large number of mindless civilians within a kilometer. One automatic servo robot after another ceaselessly controlled the heavy lumbering guns on their metal carapaces. They all lay prone in front of the heavy combat servitors, zealously pouring down a torrential rain of solid bullets towards the enemies surging in like a tide. Countless fine rain threads fell onto the scorching red metal gun barrels, constantly stirring up dense white smoke. Whenever an automatic servo robot completely exhausted its ammunition, and there were no reserve ammunition within a radius of 10 meters, they would quickly step forward to fill the gap, wielding mechanical tentacles that stretched out. Working with other automatic servo robots who became a melee steel defense line, continuously tearing apart those surging mindless civilians, and facing a group of automatic servo robots that were completely mechanical creations, as well as heavy combat servitors clad in thick composite armor, resembling humanoid mini-tanks. The Blood God cult's tactic of attrition warfare, which was usually invincible against ordinary combat teams, suffered a thorough and head-on heavy blow, even if the incomplete corpses of the mindless civilians had been piled up to a height of several meters, almost becoming a terrifying wall of flesh and blood. It still failed to make the mechanical unit executing the rearguard order retreat even a single step. Countless rocket attacks from fanatical believers and the frantic sweeping of firearms bullets only caused the heavy combat servitors to occasionally shift their shooting positions. Only those automatic servo robots whose manufacturing materials were slightly weaker would be bombarded into metal fragments flying in all directions by a large number of concentrated rocket attacks. However, when a batch of automatic servo robots, specifically responsible for destroying ammunition and supplies, and erasing traces left on the battlefield, received the order to self-destruct, unhesitatingly carrying the flamethrowers with remaining reserves that had not been completely exhausted, forcibly charging beyond the melee defense line. The fanatical believers' very arrogant and conspicuous performance was immediately suppressed again by bursts of explosive flames that soared into the sky. Soon after, as the main force of the combat team completely withdrew from the slums, this mechanical unit, composed of heavy combat servitors and automatic servo robots, also began an orderly withdrawal operation. In an instant, it seemed that a large number of excited shouts from fanatical believers erupted from the flesh and blood torrent composed of countless mindless civilians. They constantly praised the blessing power of the blood totem, praying that the glorious achievements belonging to the blood god cult would be immortal for thousands of years. After all, facing a terrifying team of unknown origin, they launched a frantic and brave attack. The ancient blood god cult not only survived, but also achieved final victory. At this moment, the voices of praise from the fanatical believers were almost deafening, constantly echoing in the sky above the entire slum. Even the fine rain threads wantonly drifting in the sky seemed to be temporarily blasted away by the endless sound waves, scattering elsewhere. However, no blood god believer who had fallen into madness noticed. Those mindless civilians, whose numbers were too numerous to count, seemed to slowly shed streaks of scarlet blood tears from the corners of their eyes, mixing with the fine rain threads. At the same time, far away from the outer area of the slums, Luo Sha wore the power armor that was almost dyed red with blood. Standing against the fine rain threads above the Land Raider's massive vehicle body, he first slightly turned his neck, pricked up his ears to listen to a few faint shouts from inside the slums. Afterwards, Luo Sha moved his gaze expressionlessly, looking towards those scattered around the Land Raider, whose entire bodies were almost covered in the reeking blood and filth, and whose expressions were full of weariness and numbness, the gang dogs and even more male civilians. At this moment, he seemed to fall into a brief silence, or was thinking about how he should start speaking. Before long, Luo Sha took a deep breath, suddenly spoke, attracting the attention of everyone present. Now, approximately 30 hours have passed since the start of the evacuation operation. 444 gang dogs, 48 lightly and severely injured, 13 sacrificed and killed. Aaron, Jack, Abel, Alexander, every gang dog who died was a human hero who bravely sacrificed himself to save others. Their achievements may be unknown, but their names will last forever. And those civilians who fought to the death for their only home are also worthy of being firmly remembered by each of us. The total number of civilians who voluntarily joined the battle was more than 1,300, 387 lightly and severely injured, 726 sacrificed and killed. Each of them is a family's father, husband, or even son, and countless mothers, wives, and children are waiting for them to return. But they will forever remain on the battlefield, and also on the difficult road of defending their homeland. We humans have always lived in a false peace, and have been working hard to maintain this illusion. But in fact, the war against aliens and heretics has never stopped for a moment. It silently erupts in the corners we can't see, invisibly but raging. And the most foolish thing is that not many humans are willing to know the truth and stand up to expose the illusion. People are happy to continue living in the beautiful life presented by the false peace, allowing the silent lasers to cut through the sky above their heads, and only when they personally feel the burning brought by the bolter flames will they suddenly realize, oh, so the life and death war has never ended. At this moment, Luo Sha, whose voice gradually increased a lot, took another deep breath. He felt the gentle caress of the fine rain threads patting his face. A sturdy arm covered with a metal shell suddenly lifted up, and trembling fingertips pointed towards the slums not far away. Listen, they are actually celebrating victory. A group of heretics who dared to betray the human race, taking becoming an alien as their ultimate glory, and trampling the lives of countless mortals as their daily routine, are actually celebrating victory. I will never agree, no human should agree. And are you willing to agree? Before Luo Sha's voice faded away, whether it was the gang dogs gripping their weapons and trembling all over, or those male civilians who had been completely aroused in their bloodiness and goals by a series of impassioned words, they all raised a fist clenched tightly in the direction of Luo Sha. Eyes that seemed to be flowing with endless anger stared straight at the only conspicuous focal point in their vision. Even the veins popping out on their necks could not stop the terrifying roars that erupted fiercely from the depths of their chests. We don't agree, blood for blood. Give the order, even if we die in battle, I will kill them all. For family, revenge, blood debt must be paid in blood. Only in this way can we comfort all the human souls that have already been sacrificed, and those that have not yet been sacrificed, but also cannot be saved. At this moment, Luo Sha suddenly widened a pair of cyan wolf pupils. The extremely ferocious expression on his face could hardly be suppressed anymore. The snow-white fangs hidden in his mouth could not help but stick out from his lips. He quickly activated the power armor to turn around backwards. His cold gaze looked down at Iron Man David standing next to the Land Raider. David, how long until the feast we prepared for the enemy arrives? My lord, it will take another 3 minutes. Mr. Tony Stark is personally transporting it. Iron Man David slightly shook his metal head. The blue light in its eye sockets flickered as it replied to Luo Sha. Notify Tony to launch it immediately after entering the field. The current slums are no longer worth saving, so we don't need to hesitate. Also, David, how long can you maintain the global and even full-channel broadcast hijacking? Luo Sha, with a stern expression, pondered for a moment. He suddenly asked Iron Man David, My lord, I can maintain it for as long as you want, but I must kindly remind you. In this way, your future will have countless enemies. Every country and official organization on Terra will become your opponent, and every superhero will regard you as a thorn in their side and a thorn in their flesh. From the calculation ratio of input and output, it is not worthwhile. The blue light in Iron Man David's eye sockets kept flickering. Its gaze stared at Luo Sha above and said softly. And hearing Iron Man David's words, Luo Sha, with an expressionless face, slowly turned around. He said without turning his head, Think of it positively, we will also know who our friends are, and Lehman Russ will definitely like my reckless decision. David, time waits for no one, let's start immediately. Understood, my lord. Global broadcast hijacking countdown, 3, 2, 1. Buzz buzz buzz, along with a burst of electromagnetic interference and noise. A golden symbol of a double-headed eagle and a human skull superimposed appeared on every television or computer screen that was still turned on across the entire Earth. Even the full-band broadcast channels were completely hijacked by Iron Man David. Europe, Asia, North and South America, Australia, even the North and South Poles. Almost every human who noticed the unusual noise nearby, whether male, female, old, or young, couldn't help but stop their current actions. Their expressions were either surprised, or looked towards the location where the sound came from with suspicion, subconsciously listening. This is the North American continent, the Chimalhuacan large slum located in central Mexico. An annihilation and evacuation operation against the evil heretical organization, the Blood God cult, ended in failure. Now, the final moment has come for us to fulfill our mission. In the name of the sole loyalty to all of humanity and the immortal Emperor, and in the name of the grace bestowed by the glorious Golden Throne, I hereby declare that this slum is being issued a regional extermination order. In the Emperor's name, we will not allow a single tainted alien flesh or a single unclean heretical dust to escape the extermination and purification of the fires of justice. I, in the name of the 23rd Primarch, personally sign the death certificate of this slum. Let hundreds of thousands of human souls be completely forgotten by the world. May we bring balance to the Inquisition of humanity, and may the Emperor bless their innocent and pure souls. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.